Welcome to GS Podcast number 80, brought to you by Audible. Audible's leading supplier of audiobooks. It's where you go if you want an audio version of one of your favourite books. Maybe a new book you haven't read, maybe you don't have time to read, maybe you commute a lot, maybe you cycle, maybe you ski, I don't know. Audible's where you go if you want some audio in your ears. And as a listener of this podcast, don't ski while listening to audio actually, very dangerous. As a listener of this podcast, it entitles you to a 30-day free trial and a free audiobook that you can keep forever. It also helps to support this podcast too. So if you head on over to audibletrial.com/GS. I have a fantastic guest on this episode for you. Michael Nugent's returning. Michael Nugent's the chairperson for Atheist Ireland and a tireless campaigner for secularism and human rights and atheism in general. And we covered a really wide range of topics within the hour actually, so I'm really interested in getting some feedback, but if you want to support Michael and his efforts and all the great work of the people who work for Atheist Ireland and see what campaigns they're working towards, you can find out some more information at atheist.ie. You can keep up to date on this very podcast at gspellchecker.com, and if you have any follow-up questions for Michael Nugent, or you just want to send him some feedback or send him some kind words, send him some love, you can find him on Twitter at Mick Nugent. Enjoy!
There's a word that some folks find real hard to spell. Ain't it horrible for me, except after seeing who cared to go burn in hell? But then along came a man, a spell took a broken God or creed, and he set out upon a noble quest to help those that don't know what it means. And he said, go A-T-H-E-I-S-T, and don't you put that I before that E. A-T-H-E-I-S-T, don't mean we know.
It's a great pleasure to welcome Michael Nugent back to the GS Podcast. Hello.
Hiya, always happy to be here.
Excellent. I mean, last time we spoke, I think it was 2014, and you shared the podcast with Michael Sherlock and DM Murdoch. And I suppose, sorry to start on such a bum note, but DM Murdoch's no longer with us, unfortunately. And I just thought maybe you could let us know how you knew her.
Yeah, it's very sad. I mean, she died of cancer. My own wife died a few years ago of cancer. There's two members of the Atheist Ireland committee have relatives who have died or are dying of cancer at the moment. I mean, it seems to be the one disease that medicine still hasn't quite got the hang of, and hopefully it will at some stage in the future. But I mean, she was an inspirational promoter of reason and of evidence-based research. And it's very sad that she's no longer with us. Yeah,
agreed. I mean, just to say as well, I think you write very eloquently about your late wife. I read your latest blog post about that, and I believe it's been a first anniversary of her death recently, hasn't it?
Yeah, well, actually, fifth anniversary. I mean, time seems to fly. It seems like it's less than a year, but it's just one of those things that, I mean, it puts into perspective the things that you normally get into a fluster about. And it makes you realise the value of every day that you have alive and of the good that you can do in helping other people to live their lives as freely as possible.
Or maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you got into secular activism or activism in general. It seems like a big theme of your life for a few decades, really. I was wondering, what is it that made you active in these areas?
Well, I've always, I suppose, been politically active with a small p, but when I left college, which would have been in the 1980s, the really big political issue in Ireland was the terrorism in Northern Ireland. Mm-hmm. And so I got involved in campaigning on a cross-party basis against both IRA terrorism and loyalist paramilitary terrorism, and also against times when either the British or Irish state acted outside the law and killed people other than in immediate danger of life to other people. So it seemed to me at the time that was the only issue that people were being murdered about on the island on a regular basis, and so we campaigned to promote, first of all, the right to life in an actual sense, as opposed to the theoretical pro-life position of people who don't really seem to care much about what happens to fetuses after they're born. But we campaigned for that, and also for not for any particular outcome in Northern Ireland politically. Like, we didn't really care whether it was a united Ireland or a maintenance of the United Kingdom, but that whatever institutions of state were there would be based on human rights and mutual respect, and freely given allegiance to whatever institutes of state were there. And then when that issue was, I won't say resolved, but when that issue was more or less resolved with the Belfast Agreement, the next most significant, all-encompassing issue seemed to be the control that the Catholic Church had on the state here, and the Protestant churches in Northern Ireland. And so it seemed a natural extension then to campaign on trying to separate church and state, trying to bring about a state where people are free to believe whatever they want and to manifest whatever religious or non-religious beliefs that they want, but without the state taking sides on either side of the debate.
Yeah, I mean, touching back on what you said about the quote-unquote pro-life movement, it is, they don't seem to have much care about the life in the here and now, and I often think they should just be forced to rename themselves to the pro-birth movement. Yeah,
it's a very strange thing. I mean, our constitution has a clause put in place by the campaigns by the Catholic Church in the 1980s that gives a fetus equal rights to a pregnant woman, which is extraordinary ethical position to take. And but in that it's the right to life. The wording is the right to life of the unborn. It's just a noun. Unborn as a noun as opposed to an adjective. Like it's almost like the undead. This is like some sort of abstract concept that they're trying to defend rather than actual conscious, living, sentient beings, which is what the pregnant woman is.
I mean, you mentioned the troubles there, and I'm probably wading into murky water, but I think, how much would you say religious sectarianism played a role in that? Because depending on who you speak to, some will say it's everything, some will say it had nothing whatsoever, and I'm wondering where the truth lies, really, from someone who knows more about it than I do.
Well, I suppose it depends on the individual. Some people are more religious than others. There's certainly in from 1916 onwards and before that, there's a tradition in what's called Irish republicanism, which isn't republicanism in the kind of the French secular sense. It's essentially promoting a united Ireland as opposed to maintenance of the union with Britain. But that had, like, through Padraig Pearse, who was essentially a fanatical, delusional Catholic, who was wanted to promote a sort of blood sacrifice in the spirit of Jesus dying at Easter as part of his revolutionary ideas, and so it kind of carried through. Now, to a certain extent, for a lot of people, it wouldn't have been for a lot of people. On both the nationalist and unionist sides of the fence, it would be people who are just who are living in circumstances where they feel oppressed, and who turn to paramilitaries as their perceived protection against the situation that they're growing up in. Now, that leads to a kind of vicious circle where one side seems to think that if they kill people from the other side, that will make the other side more likely to surrender. Yet they realise when somebody is killed on their own side, that it makes them more determined not to surrender. So you've got this kind of vicious circle of people getting deeper and deeper into it. So it's a mix of both. And on the Protestant side, there's certainly with the Reverend Dean Paisley, there was a very Protestant, anti-Vatican, anti-Papist fundamentalism there. So it's a mix. It's a mix of the two. With the paramilitaries, I think a lot of it was just turf wars. I would say that it's closer to just mafia behaviour than either nationalist or unionist aspirations. It was protection rackets. It was paramilitary policing of areas. It was smuggling businesses. There was a lot of things that were just by anybody's standards pure criminal behaviour.
Yeah, definitely a complex issue. I mean, we touched a little bit on abortion moments ago, and I know it's illegal in the Republic of Ireland where you are, and I knew that as well that there was a lot of women travelling to Britain to seek an abortion. But what I didn't realise was just quite high those numbers were, and that's really quite troubling, isn't it?
It is. Well, as you see, we've got this strange situation in Ireland where we pretend to deal with problems by pretending that they don't exist. And what we've done with abortion is everybody knows that women go to England for abortion. And so when we passed this referendum to make abortion unconstitutional, not just illegal, but unconstitutional in the 1980s, it was accepted by both sides of the argument that this wouldn't stop women from going to England for abortions. Now, to me, that shows that the people who are opposing abortion aren't genuinely opposing abortion. If they genuinely believed that women were going to England to murder children, they would want to stop them from going. They would be stopping them from leaving the country. But the only time that did happen, in the 1990s, there was a raped teenage girl who was going to England for an abortion, and her parents contacted the police and said, can we use the DNA from the fetus in our legal case against the person who she says raped her? And the response of the police was to send it to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General took out an injunction against this raped 14-year-old girl to stop her from travelling to England for an abortion. Now, that caused a public outcry, and the constitution was changed to allow women to travel abroad for abortions, which again is an extraordinary situation, that we had a constitutional referendum to allow women to travel outside the country. It's a bizarre situation to be voting on something like that. And so now we're in a situation where the people that are most discriminated against by the law against abortion are people who are either too poor or for medical reasons unable to travel abroad, and so they're the ones that feel the brunt of it at the moment.
Right. Are these people who want to seek an abortion in England, are they essentially just completely on their own, or is there some way of working a system? Is there back channels? Is there unspoken groups that will assist them, or is it a case of find your own way?
Well, no, there will be, at this stage, overtly supportive organisations, the Abortion Rights Campaign, the Campaign to Repeal the Eighth Amendment, various groups. There are more formal groups, like the Irish Family Planning Association, but the more formal groups would be subject more strictly to the law that would prevent you from encouraging or counselling women in support of having abortions. But I think it's and certainly with the availability of information over the internet these days, I think they've lost the battle of trying to stop women from getting information. But the difficulty is as I say, if you're too poor to travel, or if you or if you're in hospital, if you're stuck actually literally in the hospital system, like Savita Halappanavar, who died a few years ago, when she asked for an abortion, they refused to give her an abortion, and one of the medical people told her husband that it's because this is a Catholic country, and she ended up dying. So it's a shocking situation. Unfortunately, in Ireland, we only seem to make progress when there's a tragedy, when there's a human tragedy, and people stop thinking of it in abstract terms and start thinking of it in terms of real sentient people, suffering unnecessarily and dying unnecessarily. Then we recognise, we've got to do something about this. But then what happens is the government does the absolute minimum that it possibly can, consistently with its human rights obligations and legal obligations, and tries to just cover it over in that way. When we were over a couple of months ago, or actually this one was a couple of years ago, to put it into context, Atheist Ireland travels to Geneva to the United Nations when the UN Human Rights Committees are preparing to question Ireland under human rights treaties. And a couple of years ago when we were over there, the issue of abortion was raised, and Ireland said that the reason that they don't give women the right to abortion was because of votes, the constitutional referendum and parliamentary votes and so on. And the UN Human Rights Committee told Ireland that is a completely unacceptable reason to deny people their human rights. They said that it undermines the entire process of human rights law, that the purpose of human rights law is to protect individuals from the tyranny of the majority, and that you cannot use majority votes to derogate from your obligations in these human rights treaties. Now, Ireland accepted over in Geneva that point, and said, yes, we agree that majority votes can't overrule human rights, and yet they came back and continued to do so.
Is Ireland obligated to act on any of these recommendations or criticism? Is there anything they have to do in response?
Well, there are two ways that the United Nations human rights treaties operate. One is they're overseen by the UN Human Rights Committees. Now, those committees are independent legal human rights experts who just test is the behaviour of the state compatible with the treaty. Now, they're legally obliged to implement the treaty. They're not, unfortunately, legally obliged to accept the interpretation of the UN Human Rights Committee as to the way that the treaty should be implemented. So to a certain extent, it's more a question of giving us political ammunition to say, look, here are human rights experts who are saying that this is how it should be interpreted, and when you have, committee after committee after committee of independent experts telling them that they're getting it wrong, that should have some political weight. The second thing that the UN human rights treaties are implemented by is there's the human rights council. Now, that's different than the committee. The council is more political. The council is more like a peer review process where the states examine each other, and so that's I think a little less clean as a method of examining things. If, like, for example, you have one of the subcommittees of the Human Rights Council has Saudi Arabia as its chair, so that's not a good sign. So essentially there's two things. There's the committees, which you should pay a lot of attention to, and there's the council, which is a more political body.
Okay, I mean, do you have any cause for optimism in this area? Do you think you'll see a change anytime soon in regards to these laws on abortion?
Well, yeah, I'm very optimistic generally, because I tend to look at things in the long term, and the world is becoming more secular. If you look at the results of the World Values Survey, you'll see that. If you look at other surveys about secularism around the world, you'll see that as people move away from survival values towards self-expression values, countries move away from traditional religious values and towards secular rational values. Now, that's happening around the world. It's certainly happening in Western liberal democracies, and there's no reason to think that Ireland is going to be an exception to that. So I think it's a question of when rather than whether, but the difficulty is along the way that there are individual people who are suffering from human rights abuses until we catch up with the civilised Western liberal democracies.
The issues that I think really are being held back mostly by religion, I suppose, is kind of like gender equality, gay LGBT rights, and this issue of abortion. And it's just odd to see how something like abortion can be a really big sticking point in Ireland, yet it's one of the most liberal places in Europe in terms of LGBT rights, isn't it? It
is. Well, I think what's happening is the people have moved on ahead of the politicians and ahead of the laws and ahead of the constitution. So when, as in the LGBT marriage or marriage equality referendum, when the people got a chance to vote, we voted overwhelmingly in favour of marriage equality, and in fact became the first country in the world to legalise marriage equality by public vote as opposed to by a law or by a judicial decision. So the people have certainly moved on, but unfortunately the politicians haven't and the constitution hasn't. So you have these things like abortion, which is stuck in the constitution, and so it requires a constitutional referendum to change it, and the politicians are reluctant to hold a referendum because they don't want the hassle of having something where, regardless of the fact that the majority are going to probably go one way, that they will still have a very emotive public debate that will result in some people deciding not to vote for them. So that's what we have to get over. We have to get the politicians to catch up with the people.
Last time we spoke, we were touching predominantly on blasphemy laws and the issues Ireland has. And I think you tend to. I think you were telling me at the time that some of the more theocratic states were citing Ireland's regulations on blasphemy as a template they'd like to adopt, and I just wondered if there's been any more progress in terms of that issue.
No, there hasn't. I mean, there's still been continual highlighting of it by us and others as an issue, but we have had an election recently which has resulted in a hung parliament. So we don't know what the new government is going to be. What the old government did is they accepted based on the campaigns against the blasphemy law. They accepted that they would hold a constitutional referendum to remove the blasphemy law, but then they didn't do it. And what they did is they said, we'll put that off for the next government to deal with. So to a certain extent, we've made progress in that they're no longer trying to defend it, but we now have to wait to see what government will be formed in the aftermath of the last election and push them to take the decision to hold a referendum.
Has anyone fallen foul of these blasphemy laws in Ireland in recent times that you know of?
Not formally, but we are aware of a lot of self-censoring by the media, and particularly local newspapers and radio stations who don't have the resources to fight a legal campaign if there was a blasphemy charge. So even though a lot of people feel that it's unlikely, the media outlets whose purpose typically is just to run a business rather than to stand up for freedom of expression, will just back away from it and just won't publish stuff. I know that I've been told, although less so now in recent times, but certainly initially after the law came in, when I would be doing, say, a live program on television or radio, I would be warned in advance. You're aware that there's a blasphemy law, and please don't say that that's going to get us into trouble on this. So it's more a kind of a self-censoring effect, and then it combined with its international impact, where it is still used internationally by the Islamic states to say there's a Western democracy passing a new blasphemy law in the 21st century. Nothing wrong with our blasphemy laws, despite the fact that say Asia Bibi in Pakistan is facing execution for blasphemy, for allegedly blaspheming against Muhammad, and she's a Christian woman. Two politicians who spoke out in her favour, the governor of Punjab, who was a Muslim, and the minorities minister was a Christian, were both murdered for speaking out in her favour, one murdered by his own bodyguard. So, and that's the country, Pakistan, who was leading the charge at the UN on behalf of the Islamic States, praising Ireland's blasphemy law.
How specific is the law in terms of what's to be considered blasphemy? It seems like an unquantifiable term sometimes, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, our law, the phrase is saying or publishing, let's see if I can remember this now, saying or publishing anything grossly offensive or abusive in relation to matters held sacred by any religion, thereby causing outrage among a substantial number of adherents of that religion. Now, there's a number of flaws in that wording that are immediately obvious to even a child looking at it, but the most dangerous part of it, I think, is that the first test is that outrage is demonstrated. And really, in these circumstances, the last thing that you want to be doing is creating an incentive for people to demonstrate outrage when we know that there are certain groups who are quite good at doing that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, talking about outrage, I suppose this is a nice segue, and something that I've noticed has taken up quite a bit of your time, which I think's taken up quite a bit of your time unfairly, unfortunately, is the issue we have with online smears and how quick they can grow, and whether or not the time spent addressing them is worth the cost of amplifying some of them. And I always enjoy your writing on this. I always think it's very clear and very fair. And I was wondering, how have you felt about the way communications change in terms of the internet and what that brings to issues of libel and how information can spread so quickly?
Well, I think unfortunately on the internet there's a combination of people. First of all, they're behaving anonymously a lot of the time. Secondly, they're speaking to people that they can't see, so it's almost like as if you're not speaking to a real human being, and so there's a tendency to just dial the outrage up to 11 as the opening gambit, and if you disagree with somebody. Mm-hmm. Now that in some senses is it's been going on for a long time, but what has happened now is it's been there's an overlap between that and people who try to promote political agendas where they will, instead of just abusing somebody, they'll say that they're racist or sexist or homophobic or Islamophobic or whatever you're having yourself, phobic or transmisogynistic or whatever phrase that they think is going to be the most emotive label that you can put on somebody. And what that does is it essentially closes down any opportunity to have reasonable conversation, because your options are either to just walk away from it, which a lot of people do, or to be abusive back, which is what some people do, or the approach that I try to take is just rationally ask them repeatedly to explain what they mean by that, and put them in a position where they have to either explain it or or else be seen, if not by themselves, be seen by outside observers to be being unreasonable.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the most uncharitable view of anyone's comments is the one that's jumped on first. And I think, I mean, I've seen with you as well, and I found your language very unambiguous and quite clear. And when someone's took exception to it and you've taken the time to clarify, they've even took the clarification and read things into that aren't there. And it's just, I think, where does it end in terms of finding the line between ignoring these people and actually doing their work a little bit by amplifying what they're doing?
Well, somebody pointed out to me recently that P.Z. Myers, who was one of the people who was the worst proponent of this type of behaviour,
yes.
That if you look at if you do a Google search for his name now, that something like 4 or 5 out of the top 10 results are people analysing how bad his behaviour is. So to a certain extent, that can be useful. I mean, it means that when people are trying to follow the arguments that those people are making, that the counter arguments are going to be available as well, and so gradually, I think you see most people are reasonable. And most people reading something, and particularly reading a sequence of interactions, will be able to see who's being reasonable and who's not. So you have to kind of accept that some people just will, whatever you say, will misinterpret it. And as you say, in terms of misinterpreting the clarifications, I think that's probably the best test psychologically for me, is that if somebody genuinely misinterprets something that I say, I think that's fine. I'm not perfect. I will say things that people will misinterpret in all good faith. But once you've clarified it, they still go on about it, then I have my doubts about whether they're acting in good faith.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting what you said about P.Z. Myers. I mean, I think he's a kind of he could be like a psychological experiment, because a little while back I wrote a blog, I think you linked to it actually, where he'd accused Christopher Hitchens of saying something very specific, and luckily this thing that he was alleged to have said was available for all in a video, and when you watch the video it's clear that he hasn't said that thing. So I call it fact snap. You have a claim in one hand and the truth in the other, and you can great thing about the internet, I suppose, is that you can put these two things next to each other so everyone can see and make their own mind up, and that should cause a logical person to retract what they've said. But there's something about this kind of behaviour that causes people to double down, which is exactly what P.Z. Myers did in response to this, and I'm wondering what explains this. I think probably be best off asking a psychiatrist.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's a strange person. I mean, he's said of the atheist movement generally that the scum has risen to the top of the atheist movement and that it's burdened by crackness reactionaries. He has said that Richard Dawkins seems to have developed a callous indifference to the sexual abuse of children. Mm-hmm. He's referred to Russell Brackford as a lying fuckhead, and Bill Maher, Matt Taylor, assholes. Abby Smith is leading a coterie of slimy acolytes, and he called an Irish blogger who had said she had experienced mental illness a narcissistic wanker. So, I mean, it's just extraordinary behaviour from and I find, you see, because we're used to it, because we're sort of saying it one step at a time, I think even we become desensitised to how outrageous it is. Because what I find is when I'm talking to people who aren't involved in the atheist movement about this, and they're explaining it, they're kind of going, what the hell? and then I explain to them, that this guy is a university professor, and they just nearly fall on the floor laughing. I mean, I think historians looking back on this era and seeing how people behaved online will probably, as you say, be doing psychological studies of it in retrospect.
Yeah, remember, everything lasts forever on the internet, so be careful. I was wondering if you could touch on any current campaigns you're currently spearheading, or any upcoming events that you want to talk about.
Well, we have a few pretty important things coming up at the moment. We have the Irish census is coming up on the 24th, which is next Sunday. Last time around, with about 250,000 people ticked the no religion box. Now, we think that's quite low because the way that the question is phrased is what is your religion, and it kind of so it assumes you have a religion. So a lot of people will by default just fill in their childhood religion. So we have a campaign asking people to notice that there is a box at the bottom of that saying no religion, and to fill that in if they're not religious. We have a campaign with the United Nations at the moment under a process called the Universal Periodic Review that's questioning Ireland. We were over in Geneva last month briefing the various countries and their state delegations about the problems in Ireland and that. And the main problems that we're highlighting there are the blasphemy law, religious discrimination in the education system, religious oaths for high political and judicial office, and the overall position where Ireland is now claiming that this is an extraordinary thing when you think about it. Ireland is now claiming that the state is constitutionally obliged to buttress religious discrimination in the education system and elsewhere because it is obliged to buttress religion. So that's a hugely significant thing. It's almost what has happened is that we have been gradually peeling away their political justifications for the religious discrimination, and now they're kind of in a Custer's last stand of arguing that they're constitutionally obliged to do this. So those are some of the type of things that we're doing. We're also involved in a campaign about state payments for chaplains. Now, there's a lot of money. There's about 9 million a year spent on chaplains in primary and secondary schools. Now, those schools are religious schools. I mean, they're run by religious organisations, 90% by the Catholic Church, paid for by the state, but run with religious ethos and with exemptions from our equality laws that explicitly allow them to discriminate on the ground of religion. But what we've discovered is, on top of that in universities and colleges and institutes of technologies, which are not religious bodies and which should be secular, that there's another 1.5 million being spent on chaplains there. And that is done without any tender process. The universities just give the money to the local Catholic bishop, and the Catholic bishop appoints a priest who comes in, gets paid by the state up to €50,000 a year. And in some cases, in terms of the religious elements of the job, we've discovered that where they hold masses, there might be in a university, there might be 4 or 5 people attending the mass. So the religious element of it is irrelevant in all, to all intents and purposes to the job. And we're arguing that they should have, if they're having that position of essentially a quasi-counsellor, that it should be open to anybody to apply with proper application and then interview procedures, and not just given to the local Catholic bishop.
Okay, I mean, I was at the Secularist of the Year Awards there last month it was, and Educate Together picked up the top prize, and I noticed they operate from the Republic of Ireland, and I was wondering if you're familiar with them, if you think that kind of thing's a good alternative.
That's a tricky one now, because Educate Together is by far the best current option for secular parents, but it's not the solution. And in fact, in our opinion, it is making the solution harder to attain. The context is that 90% of our primary schools are run by the Catholic Church. The mechanism by which that is done is that the state appoints what it calls patron bodies to run the schools, and they're allowed to run the schools according to their own ethos. So what Educate Together have done is they've said, well, we want to be patron bodies, and we'll set up schools that have a multi-denominational ethos. And so they've done that with a small number of schools, but they've less than 100 schools out of over 3,000. Yeah. And so to some extent what they do is they provide some relief to a small number of typically well-educated, relatively well-off secular families who, because part of it is, you have to have the ability and resources to literally set up a school and run it, which a lot of people can't do. So it provides that relief for some families, but at the expense of leaving most secular families in a position where their only local school is still a Catholic school, where there's no chance ever of there being an Educate Together school, and yet people get the impression that the problem is being addressed because there's this small number of Educate Together schools. The other problem is that there's still essentially private bodies running state schools. And our opinion is that state schools should be run by the state, and that even though Educate Together's philosophy is a lot closer to ours than is the Catholic Church, it's still not the way to run the state education system, to just let individual groups to run schools on the basis of any philosophy that in effect will exclude others. Because if you think about it, if your only available state school in an area is an Educate Together school, and you don't want that, then you're in the same position as a secular family whose only state school is a Catholic school.
Right, yeah, plenty to think about there that I hadn't considered really. So, I mean, I suppose it's kind of not really, I mean, it's helpful in a way, but it's not addressing the grassroots issue of faith schools in Ireland then.
Yeah, it's very helpful for those who have access to it, and very unhelpful for the majority.
I just want to shift the pace a little bit and talk about some a bit of left field, which is I've seen that you identify as a vegetarian, and I think I've seen that you was trying to move over to veganism. I'm not sure how that went. And I'm a vegetarian myself, and I kind of feel that this issue of meat consumption is a blind spot within the skeptical community, and I have some very colourful conversations with people who identify as skeptics, and I was just wondering what that means to you if you're still not eating meat.
Still not eating meat, and I have successfully transitioned to being vegan. I think it's, as you say, I think it is a blind spot. I think that as atheists, we should recognise that humans share the planet with countless other sentient beings, and that the suffering and well-being of those other beings is just as real as ours, that they weren't placed on earth by an imaginary God to satisfy our conveniences and desires. And I think what vegans essentially think is that we recognise that ethics is well, say certainly as an atheistic vegan, I would recognise that ethics is based on evolutionary attributes of our brains, like empathy and compassion and fairness and justice and so on. And so I would try to treat humans and other animals with the golden rule of treating others as you'd like to be treated yourself. And so I think it's, for me, it seems like a seamless transition that as an atheistic vegan that I would try to protect humans from the harm caused by religion, and I would also try to protect other animals from the harm caused by humans. And hopefully more people will move in that direction.
Yeah, it's a difficult conversation because eating meat's one of them things that almost everybody does, and it's something it's culturally ingrained. It's something you're born with. It's everywhere you look in advertisements, and it's normalised. And I don't think people make that link between the food on the plate and the animal in the farm. And I find it difficult. I struggle to approach this subject with people in a way that doesn't seem like I'm questioning their ethical integrity. And I was wondering maybe if there's a way you can have this conversation a bit better, perhaps.
Well, it's hard because in a sense we're not questioning their ethical integrity, we're questioning their ethical judgment.
Yes.
And so I mean, I've no doubt that the people who are eating meat, in their mind they're not doing anything wrong. And in fairness, I ate meat for certainly from my childhood up till into my early and mid 20s, and then it took me quite a while to move from vegetarian to veganism. So I mean, it's not something that you can insist that everybody does immediately. You've just got to just as in anything, as in promoting atheism and secularism, you've just got to constantly plant seeds that at some stage in the future, so somebody might think, actually, there's a point there that I might think about. Yeah,
it's absolutely, definitely progressing in the right direction. How can people support Atheist Ireland? The website's atheist.ie, isn't it?
Yeah, we've atheist.ie as our main website. We have a weekly email newsletter called Secular Sunday that you can subscribe to. We have a separate website called Teach Don't Preach, which is for our secular education campaign. And if you're in a situation where you need help or advice, either opting your child out of religious instruction, or if your child is being bullied in school or discriminated against on the basis of that, you can contact us through our Teach Don't Preach site. Jane Donnelly, who's our human rights officer, runs that, and you can contact her at humanrights at atheist.ie. And then we have a couple of other kind of websites. We one for our blasphemy campaign called blasphemy.ie and a few others. But the main one, atheist.ie, and then we're also on Facebook and Twitter.
Excellent. I know you spend a fair bit of time in the public as well, sometimes setting up stalls so people can approach and ask questions. And I was just wondering, what's the general response like from the Irish public?
It's pretty good. We do what we call information tables once a month in Dublin on the first Saturday of each month. Second Sunday of each month, we have a secular Sunday brunch where that people can come to and just meet people of just like-minded people and just for a social afternoon. And then we have also information tables and brunches around the country, and you get information on those on our website. We don't approach people. We have a policy of not trying to, evangelize or hassle people on the streets. We're there, and if people come up to us, we'll answer their questions. And we find generally that most people are either just impressed to see us there, or we got a small number of people who are, who'll just have some sort of religious argument that they want to get off their chest, and will then stroll on without really interacting with us. And then I'm sure we have a lot of people that just look at us and think that we're crazy.
That's okay though. What do you get a lot? I mean, where I live in Manchester, and I spend quite a fair time in the Piccadilly area, and it's quite diverse in terms of street preachers. It seems like everyone's represented in that little area of the city. And I was wondering, is there a high influx of people preaching on the street in Ireland?
It is. It's a lot, and in fact, that's why we set up the table initially. It wasn't really to promote atheism, but it was to counter the number of religious preachers that were around that part of the city, and so that at least if there were vulnerable people who were exposed to these people, that there would at least be an alternative viewpoint there as well. So yeah, there is a lot, and I suppose there is in any major city in the Western world, people who want to promote their own particular religious or political views.
I've just got a couple of questions from people on Twitter, if I can run those by you as well.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, Priest of Ramans asked, could Mick Nugent clarify and explain his position on whether atheism is a belief?
That's a tricky one. I know a lot of atheists will say that atheism is simply a lack of belief. I don't accept that. I think the idea of a lack of belief, of something simply being an absence of something, is intellectually incoherent. I think everything that we think is a belief, and even if you believe that it's a lack of belief, that in itself is a belief. I think the argument that atheism is not a belief arose as a counter to religious people saying, well, this is our belief and that's your belief, and sure, they're all the same, and so yours has no more credibility than ours. I don't think that's where we should hold the line. I think we should hold the line at there are some beliefs that are more reliable than others because they are consistent with and proportionate to the best currently available evidence. And so I think that the belief that there is no God is a more reliable belief and a more defensible belief than the belief that there is a God, because there is considerably more evidence that humans invented the idea of gods than there is that gods actually exist. So I accept that in the general sense, some people identify with atheism as being simply a lack of belief. But broadly speaking, I think most people know approximately what atheism means, and there are some beliefs that are not merely likely to correlate with atheism, but that necessarily follow from atheism. And they're general beliefs; they're not specific beliefs. Like, for example, the belief that we do not get our understanding of reality from divine revelations from gods, and the belief that we don't get our morality from divine revelations from gods. Those are beliefs that are significant beliefs in a world where most people believe the opposite. And I think we should be happy to say that they're defensible beliefs.
Yeah, I think I understand where you're coming from, but I mean, is there not something to be said about atheism merely being a reaction to something? I mean, the fact that a lot of people think the word shouldn't really exist. It's so arbitrary to have to define yourself as not believing in God that it really should be the default, and a lot of people don't really have any conviction about it in terms of their identity or any activism, or they don't subscribe to other philosophies linked with atheism. They're just not convinced by any of this religious stuff. And I just wondering how active actual belief could be in that viewpoint.
Well, they're right in an ideal world, but we don't live in an ideal world. In an ideal world, we wouldn't have had to have the word anti-apartheid, but we did have to have the word anti-apartheid because apartheid existed in South Africa. Yeah. The phrase is often used that atheism is like not collecting stamps, and that there isn't a word for not collecting stamps, and that there aren't campaigns for not collecting stamps. But if hypothetically we lived in a world where where the vast majority of people believed that the post office created the universe, and believe that we have to consult our stamp collections before we pass laws, then there would be a word in that world for not collecting stamps, and there would be campaigns about not collecting stamps. So we've got to recognise that the fact that although that the other argument is correct in an ideal philosophical world, in the real world in which we live, most people do believe that we get our understandings of reality and morality from gods, and therefore it is necessary to have a word to describe the opposite. Yeah,
I think I agree with that. I mean, in terms of the anti-apartheid analogy there, I think it'd make more sense to talk about that in terms of anti-theism then, because that's a direct ideological disagreement with theism. I think atheism could just be, I'm not interested, I don't believe in it. But I mean, it's a lot to think about.
It is, but if that's you're kind of going into an etymological issue there, and you could say the same things about the word freedom or the word independence. You know, those are both words that in theory, like atheism, are referring to things that they aren't. But most people recognise that you know approximately what they mean, and don't delve into the etymology in that way.
Right, yeah, I do think you can get bogged down with defining words and arguing about semantics rather than then miss the big issues, really. So, I mean, I've got another question. I think it harks back to something we touched on earlier from Gurney Sanders. He's asked you to talk about the Irish census and the whole no religion box hidden away shenanigans. He's called it shenanigans, so I think I've seen what he's referring to. The as you mentioned before, the no religion box is quite set apart from the rest of the questions, isn't it? Do you think that's got some intent to it?
I think it is. Well, they certainly know that it is misleading. We've met with the Census Office people and we've explained to them, and they understand because they run censuses, you know, that the way that you phrase the questions is going to have an impact on the answer. Essentially what it is they say, what is your religion? Then they list in writing the 5 most popular answers from the previous census. Then there's a big box that says other religion, and then you have to write in if you have another religion. And then underneath the bottom of all that, there's a little box saying no religion. So some people will have, by default, written something into the other religion. And some people even write the word atheist into the other religion, even though atheism isn't a religion. But the big problem with it as well, even if you accept the way that they lay out or the way that they ask the question, they list the first 5 as the most popular results from the last census, but actually the second most popular result from the last census was no religion. So if that should be number 2 on their list, right, but it's not even in their written list. It's way down the bottom.
That's obviously stacking the deck a little bit, isn't it? I mean, when is the census? Is it 25th of April?
It's 24th of April, which is next weekend. And the point that we're making to people is, look, the religion question is about your religious beliefs now. You wouldn't write in your childhood home in the address area, so you don't write in your childhood religion in the religion question.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine it's very much like England in a lot of respects, in that I know a lot of people who are not Christian in any meaningful sense. They've never even read the Bible, don't attend church, but when the census comes around, they'll tick whatever they was christened in. And I think sometimes people see these things as synonymous with national identity, don't they? They see Christianity as the English one sometimes and tick that. I don't know if that kind of thing happens in Ireland as well.
Well, a lot of people would have grown up in an era where, certainly when I was in primary and secondary school, run by the Catholic Church, the ethos of the school would have been being Catholic, speaking Gaelic, playing Gaelic football, and hating the British.
It's a good mix.
So I think we've moved beyond that now, but there's probably still little remnants in people's minds.
Okay. Michael, I've really enjoyed speaking to you again. I've pretty much flown through everything I wanted to ask. Is there any topics you wanted to bring up at all before I let you get back to your day?
Is there anything important that we're doing at the moment? No, I think we've probably covered it. I think the main thing I would say in terms of Ireland is that the people have moved on beyond the politicians, and the most important place that we need to bring about change is the education system. The Catholic Church still has control over that. The control that it has over that is what enables it to maintain its influence longer than it would if we had a normal education system. And so if anybody wants to help Atheist Ireland to campaign for a secular, ethical society where the state gives no preference to either religion or atheism, and we would be as opposed to the state promoting atheism as we are to the state promoting religion, you can contact us by going to either our website, atheist.ie, or our Facebook or our Twitter accounts and get in touch with us there.
Fantastic. Thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Lovely. Great to be here.
Thank you very much to my excellent guest, Michael Nugent, and thank you very much for listening. You can keep up to date on the podcast at gspellchecker.com. Think we've all learned something here today?